But without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Sam Schifano. You can start with your presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen really quick. Okay. All right. So, d'abord, merci en pile pour être là. I want to acknowledge, while I wish I was presenting in Creole, I'm not very confident in my Creole. So I will be presenting in English today. However, I can respond to questions in both English and French. And I believe we have enough people here where we can attempt to, I can try and answer in Creole as well. So I just wanted to say grand merci en pile Cécile Axelien et Dr. Christian Flaw for being my thesis co-advisors. At the moment, my project is entitled The Nature of Women and how women respond to power in the Caribbean. I will be using an eco-feminist lens to discuss how women respond and as well as use power and have power in the Caribbean. This is a chapter draft of my dissertation, my first chapter, so I'm very excited to hear any feedback, and I'm extremely open to any and all suggestions. Without further ado, so ménage can be defined in two different ways: to extract oneself from slavery, which is referred to either as a petit ménage, which is leaving for a short period of time, or a grand ménage, which is used when an enslaved person removed themselves from the plantation. In the context of this presentation, I'm working with the idea of ménage to discuss an act of subversion and liberation within the context of the environment. In the global Norse narration of Caribbean history, it is apparent that such indigenous and enslaved bodies, for this presentation, for bodies, I am meaning reference both the physical bodies of humans as well as the bodies of nature. We are placed in passive roles. As Omasake Natasha Tinsley notes, particularly regarding women, texts take tropes like women as flowers, women as water, women as sugarcane, that were invented to justify keeping Caribbean women and territories in someone else's control. Yet women are not and were not as passive as the myth of history would have us believe. Using this connection between women, nature, and the oppression that Tinsley alludes to, I'm suggesting a reading of Marie Vauchevet's Amour of the 1968 triptych Amour, Colère et Folie. From an ecofeminist lens, I will highlight the ways in which it serves as an example of environmental ménage while also debunking the myth of passivity in women. It's especially interesting to consider fictional works because it provides an alternative point of view that differs from the history of the global North. It has the ability to create connections between the reader and the story being. It can allow for the subaltern or colonized bodies to be heard in ways in which they have been silenced. One author whose voice I will help amplify through my analysis is Marie Vauchevet. Her voice has reemerged after a long period of censorship and silencing that is both political, social, and historical. Chauvet creates a link that demonstrates the ways in which women and the physical land of Haiti, both of whom are exploited colonized bodies, interact in complex ways. She does this by focusing on the damage done to both bodies of nature, which can be defined as topsoil, greenery, trees, land, plants, as well as female identifying persons that inhabit the land. This leads to an ecofeminist reading of her work, in particular Amour. I propose this reading by borrowing ideas from the scholarship of Elisabeth Père-Vinci-Gibert and Omasake Natasha Tinsley. Père-Vinci-Gibert notes regarding Vauchevet's importance of topsoil. She is not the only one to write with a deep concern for the loss of land fertility in Haiti, but stands alone in her command of the ramifications of topsoil loss and conservation techniques, and in the specificity of her text's agrarian recommendations. Chauvet is highlighting the results of this loss of topsoil. The damage of the soil fertility and composition leads to further exploitation of the Haitian people. For instance, environmental devastation caused by landslides results in the financial cost of relying on imports from international powers, who are in part responsible for the infertile soil in which no roots can hold. We thus have the creation of a cycle of exploitation and instability. What is notable is the extensive deforestation that has continued beyond the period of dictatorship and US invasion as critiqued by Chauvet's work. According to one study from the Center of Biodiversity at Temple University, Haiti has less than 1% of its original forest, including native flora and fauna. Note, since this is for a presentation, we don't have time to go into details about this exact number, but this figure has been challenged by many scholars, which we can discuss. The ramifications of this bleed into social, political concerns on top of disastrous environmental and ecological concerns. Haitian American artist and anthropologist Gina Athena-Uris stresses the social and cultural impact of the environment and this cost that is created. She notes, in Haitian voodoo ecology, trees have always been sacred. They are significant in rituals as they are inhabited by spirits. Rapid deforestation of the island has impacted worship. As deforestation does not only concern the physical devastation, it affects the collective psyche of Haiti, and the resulting impact is incalculable in many areas of Haitian society. Works like Père Vinci Gilbert and Tinsley, among others, help us see how Caribbean women writers like Chauvet write about nature and the connection with the human bodies. But more than this, they amplify the voices of the people within the cycle of exploitation of their land and themselves. While there's instances of clear environmental ménage happening in Haiti, I wish to complicate the position of Chauvet, as well as her protagonist, Claire. Further works of mine and further chapters will examine how on the ground female identifying persons are working in the spirit of combi. But today I will be focusing on Claire. In Amour, Claire Camont is the narrator, while being simultaneously an observer and manipulator of nature. As revealed in Claire's flashback to her childhood, the reader learns how Claire has a bond with the family land and the trees on that land. When taken to her father's plantation to observe the peasant farmers, Claire reminisces, "The coffee was in bloom. Thinking back, I can still smell the bittersweetness of the coffee cherries wet with dew and mango." With this image of Claire, we observe a spiritual connection to nature through her first-person narrative of the smells, the birds frolicking, the sights she's seeing, and not only the warmth of the sun, the reader can feel, but the reader can also feel the depth of that Claire has for the land and nature. It's worth noting that when I began this project, I completely misunderstood Claire. While yes, it could be due to the fact that French is not my maternal language, I believe it was actually deeper than that. It was my desire to depict Claire as this mythological figure, an eco-feminist warrior, if you will, and plainly I wasn't listening to Claire's voice. But when I re-examined her, I discovered something much different. Claire is the eldest daughter of a coffee merchant, depicted externally as a spinster at 39 years old. That's very encouraging. And a passive maiden who in the surface appears to mainly represent the complications of a single narration. But she is far more complex. To look at her relationship to land, Claire, upon inheriting her land, sold acres to peasant farmers trying to cultivate little plots of land to sell coffee. This could be seen as an act of her assisting her community. However, in response to these farmers being in competition with her in her remaining land, Claire sold her coffee beans to the international seller, Monsieur Petrol, for a lower price to price gouge the farmers. While the farmers did not accept this behavior passively and actually went to Monsieur Petrol to protest this exploitative action, they and their families were then slaughtered. As Claire looks on passively from her window, I'm open to dialogue on how to define the action of the workers. Was this an act of ménage? Were these farmers' attempt at fighting back against this economic submission? Interested to dig into that more. Yet later lamenting the loss of her land to these external powers, Claire underscores the extent of US power and influence, and thereby desire for profit that recycles the practice of colonialism centuries before. Coffee exists only in our memories. Monsieur Long is no longer interested in coffee. The export of wood has replaced this trade. When there is no more wood, he will move on to something else. Perhaps he will trade in men. While she is observing this devastation done by the foreigner, Monsieur Long, Claire's role is further complicated by her family and her business ties to Monsieur Long, as she is financially benefiting from the deforestation efforts. Furthermore, she is also profiting off the exploitation of her land as a member of a white mulatto bourgeois family. To dig deeper, however, into the character of Monsieur Long, we must look at his positionality. While there are two recurring characters who reinforce the exploitation of both women and nature, the first one that we'll examine today is Monsieur Long, an American who is the director of the Export Corporation and thus a metonym for the US occupation from 1950 to 1934, entre guillemets, continue jusqu'à aujourd'hui, which wants to continue the deforestation of Haiti for profit. The second one being a local Haitian man, Commandant Caladou. He is a violent man who uses his position to abuse and violate the town into submission, while working with Monsieur Long to profit off the destruction of land and bodies. Monsieur Long is described by Claire as a fat, bloated, congested man. Under the heat and sun, he looks like a scalded lobster. With his size reflecting the image of the United States that has consumed a country like Haiti, and the red of his skin is the sun that rejects him. During a party at the Clermont residence, when he is speaking to the group about his business, he observes, "The tinder stock in the mountains and even the town is just extraordinary. This island is amazing. The seas, the mountains, the trees. Yes, it's a real pity that they are so poor and unlikely." From this quote, Vieux Chevet positions Monsieur Long as a consumer of the island. He doesn't view the island with admiration like Claire, but rather as an object that he can consume for profit. Later, he states as a response to Jean Luz, Claire's brother-in-law, who's inquiring about what the deforestation will do to the soil, matching the concerns of Père Vinci Gibert. "Oh, well, that, my dear friend, is their business. They can either agree to sell their wood, or we can leave. We're not asking them for a gift, not at all." As he views it, he is helping the poor and unlucky, quote unquote, by giving them money. Claire also notes, quote, Monsieur Long speaks of this country, Monsieur Long speaks of his country, so rich, so beautiful, so well organized, it seems. What does he come looking for in this hole, if not wealth? This shows a bit more of the contradiction of Claire, being critical of the economic exploitation of Haiti by an American, as well as environmental exploitation, while being both critical of her home, quote, "this hole," and looking upon her physical world around her with admiration. Claire states, quote, "Despite the ruins, despite the poverty, our little town remains beautiful. I realize this once in a while." Claire looks upon the land of Haiti with contradiction and complexity, which reflects the complex nature of Claire and thus women. Claire often has to fight and comment on Monsieur Long's desire for the continued deforestation of Haiti. She observes, "For 15 days, we heard Monsieur Long's electric saw running continuously. Every 5 minutes, a tree fell. I climbed up the coast yesterday to witness the slaughter." Claire's narration transmits the impact of deforestation on nature and thus herself as a woman. It would take processions to stop the rain. It falls continuously and unintentionally just after the intensive falling of trees. Avalanches of earth stream downwards the mountains and pile up at our feet. Claire often speaks to nature, and especially of trees. When she walks, she listens to them. Huge trees fell to the ground with their enormous noise, as if they were roaring before they breathed their last. Claire hears the cries of others as well. "Our land is ruined. We have deforested too much." As well as reflecting, "My sisters and I were left to listen to the lamentation of the trees uprooted by blasts of wind and man." Now, the counterpart to Monsieur Long is Commandant Caladou, who is the head of the local police force whose job it is to terrorize the town. He is described as a ferocious black man who has been terrorizing us for about 8 years now. He wields the right of life or death over us, and he abuses it. Caladou prompts intense fear and disdain in Claire. causing much internal distress and internal reflection. While Caladu works alongside Monsieur Long to beat the town into submission to get out their land for profit, he is often overheard speaking to Monsieur Long concerning the deal of selling wood from the trees on their land. He states, "They'll give in. Hunger will make them see reason." He is willing to starve his own people and destroy his own land for economic profit. And Claire is constantly terrorized by him, his mere physical presence, as well as his appearance in her dream. While seemingly Claire's initially terrified of action, as seen in her internal monologue, she presents herself as passive, never resisting openly. Unclear. This is also seen in her desire, but lack of action for Jean-Luc. That is, we will discuss later. She observes his brutalization of the peasants and attempts to strike against Monsieur Long for better prices for their lumber. Claire is being seen observing the protests, observing the violence, which is at odds with the fierceness of her inner dialogue as well as her passivity. When questioned of her fear of Caladu, Claire is told by Jean-Luc not to make an outward display of her disdain for him. Claire responds internally with, "Who does he take me for? I, who tremble with fright at the slightest noise? I, who avoid suspects to the point that I won't see Dora, a local woman who is unfortunately brutalized by Caladu. I, who won't exchange words or looks with these armed men, and here he thinks me capable of braving that hangman Caladu, the fool. I am a coward and I know it." This comment, however, does not deter Claire from allowing this disdain and hatred to grow within her for him. Before digging into the paper, I want to take a moment to call upon theoretical work that discusses the disruption of mythopassivity that we see in Claire. And before I do that, I know I'm at 15 minutes. I have just a little bit left. Is that okay? Thank you. Thanks, Irene. One disruption of this myth occurs in Thieving Sugar by Omasake Natasha Tinsley. She examines the long-standing colonial trope of Indigenous women as sweet and beautiful and, importantly, passive beings. Tropes with which risk informing even present-day Northern receptions of sex and gender in the Caribbean. Tinsley sets on this path in order to disrupt such tropes, as do I, by uncovering a queer history, broadly erased but coded in literature. Quote, "While much queer scholarship on the global South begins by speaking about the present, I find it impossible to fully engage the present without taking stock of the erased stories of where heterogeneous sexual formations come from." As Tinsley emphasizes the erasure of queer stories, which will not be discussed here, unfortunately, she subverts the long silencing of global South. Where Tinsley does help to underscore the implications of the colonial gendering as regards to exploitation and resistance, is when she turns to colonial practice of unwomaning. Specifically, unwomaning is the disassociation of enslaved women from punitive normative colonial gender categories. In some instances, as described in narratives about anatomical human breasts, Caribbean women were animalized. And in doing so, and an unsuspecting and encompassing ecological turn, put into relationship with, quote, other species of nature. Tinsley, citing William Towerson's description of Black enslaved women, notes, "They had breasts which in the most part to be most foul, and hung low down like the udder of the goat." Furthermore, enslaved women were often referred to as beasts of burden with masculine physiques, and they were not representative of having human voices. This is an example of the animalization as discussed by Dr. Alessandra Benedicti Koken's work of Black women. Similarly to the duality of these women as discussed by Tinsley, Claire's duality emerges when she faces Caladu. Throughout the entirety of the story, she would cower before Caladu. However, in the end, as she's planning to complete suicide, she has a moment of clarity. In the end, this bitch of a life is not such a bitch when the heart has even slightest reason to hope. But what about me to have some reason of hope? Yet before she can reflect on this further, a mob on the street alerts her, observing once again the action of the peasants on the street chanting, "Down with Mr. Long." Yet at this time, Claire does not close her blind. She sits and waits. As Caladu fails to establish order and hides behind the Claire house, she removes the dagger from her breast and then proceeds to stab him multiple times. When found by Jean-Luc, Claire states, "Like an animal, he died like an animal." Finally, in this moment, the last moment of the novel, in this small but immensely powerful gesture, Claire frees herself Claire frees herself and the town and the land of exploitation via this act. We find her contemplating the fact that this entire town has risen after waiting for the chance to act. As mentioned earlier, when originally proposing this paper, I had wanted to create this depiction of Claire as an ecofeminist warrior, someone who would be the voice of nature, ready to fight against her oppressor. However, that is not the case. When I fully listened to Claire's voice, it was not as clear as anticipated. It was fierce and hesitant, both simultaneously. It was a complex mix of emotion, thoughts, filled with contradictions. I do not think this is because Marie Vauchevet didn't have a clear understanding of her character, Claire. I think it's the opposite. I think Marie Vauchevet wanted to consciously and brilliantly display the duality of women that is present to today. And I will end there. Merci en pile. And I will take any questions.
Thank you, merci en pile. I just want to be, I would just want to be sure that everyone understands English, and I'm fine to say what I say in Creole as well. And I'll be brief because the idea is to have more conversation. So I'm not going to rehash Sam's great analysis. Can I get raise of hands for anyone who prefer Creole or French? I mean, I figured I don't want to assume that everybody speaks Creole, but since I'm already speaking in one colonizer's language, I will prefer to do Creole and English if need be. In the interest of time, I don't want to say what I'm going to say in Creole as well if everybody speaks English. So can I get a show of hand if anybody needs Creole? Si gen moun ki ta reme mwen di remak ke mbral di en Creole, sou kapab leve men ou bien meton mot nan chat la. Voyon mot bay Irene. OK. OK. Merci tout le monde. Ça m'bral fait d'abord, m'bral juste fait un petit sommet bien court de ça samedi, m'bral soulever point essentiel yo, et puis après n'a ouvert salle virtuelle là pour débat, pour questions, pour commentaires. I'm just going to briefly summarize some key aspects of Sam's analysis, and then we will open it up for comments, feedback, and questions. As Sam mentioned, this is a work in progress. Comme Sam te dit, nous, c'est un travail que l'app analysé pour qui fait partie de thèse li. Alors, monsieur li a bien content pour n'importe commentaire et suggestion que nous capables de faire pour lui. Okay, m'a commencé en anglais. I'll start with English and then switch to Creole. Thank you, Sam, for this very interesting analysis that is at once looking at traditionally the ways in which women and nature have been put together, but also challenging this sometimes simplistic patriarchal representation that women in of women in nature. I particularly appreciate, and I want to hear more of your challenge of the myth. I'm using the term myth, Sam did not use it, that Haiti has less than 1% of its original forest that is still that is there. And we have to think about eco-criticism. We have to think about climate change and the environment in the context of colonization, because the very first anti-climate people were the colonizers who went to the New World and destroyed the field, you know, by the excess sugar cane. And Claire was part of that. And what I appreciate is that Sam mentioned the complexity of Claire. So for me, one way I see how we can think about Claire is to polarity thinking. The idea of it's not either or, but rather both and, because she is questioning the patriarchy by her nature. She's not married, she's resisting, but at the same time, she is part of that patriarchy, the way she interacts with people who are from a different class, with the farmers. It's very much she herself is taking over the land in those very real way, while she's in a position where the land, it is male, in that context that has power. She herself, because of her class, because has certain power, and she's using that power. I want to make sure I say some of the highlight of what I say in Creole, so I don't forget. Yon nan bagay mwen di que m'apprécier, c'est que quoi que Sam a parlé du fait que l'on a parlé de la nature, il y a une tendance pour vraiment penser à femme, représenter la nature, toute idée un peu patriarcale et dans des contextes même qu'a dit misogynie là-dedans. Mais ça qui est intéressant, c'est que lui montrer que c'est pas aussi simple que ça, parce que d'un côté, c'est vrai que Claire, non société patriarcale, et que lui manquait pouvoir, mais de l'autre côté, par le fait que Claire fait partie d'une classe sociale dominante, lui-même tout, li vin abuser la nature. Nous capables ça dans relation li gagné avec fermier yo. C'est une relation de pouvoir. Et puis, et yon nan bagay, ça me dit, c'est que Claire, en même temps, l'a observé la nature, mais l'a manipulé la nature tout. Et on l'autre bagay, moi, pensé qui est intéressant, les n'a regardé complexité Claire, c'est faut nous penser à idée de idée de polarité, c'est-à-dire que nous pas qu'à dire soit Claire X ou bien Y, mais tous les deux. C'est pas soit ci, soit ça, mais tous les deux à la fois. Et ça rend personnage Claire là beaucoup plus dynamique et beaucoup plus complexe. Yon l'autre bagay, ça me défend râler sous lui, c'est le fait que toujours gagnons mythe, il dit que il y a moins de 1% de forêt originale en Haïti qui était gon paquet de chercheurs qui y a longtemps y a dit bagay ça. Cependant, de plus en plus il y a l'autre chercheur qui questionnaient, qui dit que c'est pas vrai, et nous pas capables à parler de affaire changement climatique là sans nous pas mettre dans un contexte néocolonialiste, dans un contexte géopolitique, parce que faut nous bien songer que premier monde qui pas respecter la terre, qui vraiment détruit la terre, c'était européen yo, les yo allé dans terre qui jodi Haïti, qui Hispaniola, qui République dominicaine, c'est eux-mêmes qui détruit la terre parce que c'est volé yoye, et puis tout ça yo te vle, c'est produit sucre de même façon yo t'a détruit moun être humain, yo pas toué esclave, moun esclavagisé comme être humain, c'est même façon yo pas de respect pour la terre. Alors toute question de éco-critique n'a fait, faut nous faire dans une perspective coloniale et néocoloniale et non perspective intersectionnelle. One of the things I say in Creole, because I got excited that I didn't say in English, is that in order to really talk about eco-criticism, climate change, etc., we can only talk about it from an intersectional perspective, because you cannot remove the idea of class from the idea of climate change, from the idea of geopolitical, structural issues and infrastructure. So they all have to be steady together. And I will stop talking so that I can let others have ask questions. M'bavli prend tout temps, alors moi-même m'a suspend parler pour m'kabay l'autre moun la parole. Si nous t'avli, nous ka poser question dans chat là, nous ka voyer question ba Irène directement ou bien nous capable lever mais nous pour nous poser question. I see people can put their questions in the chat or they can raise their hands, send the question to Irene so that she can read the questions. Merci.
I'm also going to put in the chat box right away, because I was thinking of my response as Cecilia was translating. There is an organization on the ground in Haiti called Our Soil, or sometimes simply just put Soil. They are dedicated to working on the ground of waste treatment plants, climate resistance. They also say they have their hands in sanitation access as well as planting trees and focusing on, just to kind of work on some environmental issues that are affecting Haiti. And I was thinking, Cecile, I think you summarized it exactly as I was going to say, is there is a burden often on these colonized places and also sometimes lower classes, because part of the reason why it could be so devastating is because, well, colonizing powers would come in, or larger international powers would come in and overexploit. I read something once where it's not third world countries, it's just simply overexploited countries, which absolutely valid. There is also a book that I will place in the chat box. It is more of an American context, but it is called Zero Sum by Heather McGee. And she talks about how in particularly the United States, environmental issues predominantly affect BIPOC communities, and that's not by accident. And again, that myth of that Haiti only has 1%, those studies are not valid in a way because they are not taking into account everything that is happening, and also it's looking at very harsh numbers from a system developed by the global north, and it's not taking into account what's going on perfectly. So I thought, does that answer your question? I can go into more depth.
Non. Juste vle su que tout le monde tende ça samedi, il était juste à répondre un peu à point moi te fait yo, et puis il mettait deux ressources dans le chat là, qui une organisation qui est les Our Soul, et puis un livre de Heather McGee Zero Sum, et puis un bagay d'étape dit c'est que en pile moun rejete notion que c'est moun k'ap vive dans pays tant qu'Haïti que c'est yo qui responsable problème qui gagne avec climat. De plus en plus gain programme, gain gon paquet chercheurs avec activistes qui rejetaient idée ça, et puis qui montraient en fait c'est parce que c'est européen yo avec l'autre monde qui gain rapport de pouvoir yo, qui gain plus pouvoir yo, c'est yo même qui fait problème climat dans Italie. En gros, je pense que c'est ça li te vle accentuer sur lui. Question, commentaire, réflexion.
I know it's the end of the semester, so I know everyone's just done.
I think maybe while others are hopefully reflecting on questions, could I ask you? I was curious because so clearly your analysis is of the primary character, Claire, but I was wondering, are any of the peasants that are on the land that I guess her father owned, like, are they also characters? Like, are there some other women's voices in
Yeah.
the book, which I know nothing about, so apologies.
No worries at all. So unfortunately, the only other female voice, well, we have the voices of her sisters, however, not part of the peasant class. We do have Dora. I'm not remembering what her status is or her economic status. She was was a friend of Claire's, so I don't know if the same economic status goes into that. But we do have some of Dora's. We have a few quotes from Dora's. Primarily, we just have Claire's voice. It is her narration. I want to go. I will be revisiting Dora in a later chapter when I talk about how we talk about victims of assaults, especially in female identifying bodies. So she will come up again, and that relation of that specific type of power and that power dynamic. But at none of the peasant farmers really say anything, unfortunately. And that could be on purpose. I mean, maybe Claire is trying not to hide the fact that she is both, I always say a protector and manipulator of nature. That could be an intentional omission. I would maybe say that it, she intentionally is not focusing on their voices. But that's definitely an area for reflection, I think.
Yeah, and I think I would just add, it's also important to look at the three novels together. While they are separate,
Yes.
they are also together. It is a triptych, and I think that brings to light both what I will argue as Marie Vieux-Chauvet, her own stance, because keep in mind, as a literary scholar, I was trained that way, for better or worse. We cannot talk about this novel without talking about the context and the time period in which they were written. So I think we tend that when we look at them holistically, we get this complexity also of what Chauvet, what she's trying to do under a dictatorship.
Yeah, I in this chapter, I do plan on talking about Colère, because I think the character of Rose, if you've, I know you're familiar with it, Cecile, but if anyone else is, Rose is another example of, just to put it lightly, the physical effects on that exploitation could be done on a female body. So that we didn't have time to get into it today, but that's going to be in my first chapter as well. For Follet, I have to confess, I will be honest, as a graduate student, I actually haven't fully finished Follet yet, because primarily I've been focusing on Amour et Colère, but I think you're exactly right, Cecile. It's very important to talk about them all together, and I will finish Follet by the end of the semester.
No judgment.
Just to be honest.
It's a process.
Right. It's how, yeah. I'd rather be honest.
We have a question in the chat, so I'm going to give it a Creole gloss and pose it to you. Est-ce que vous pouvez parler un petit peu sur qui j'en voodoo influencer conception sur environnement ou bien la nature?
Yes. So initially, where I want to start is actually back at that quote, if I may, with Jeanette Neely's. Her work was an article published about the concept of voodoo, and with nature spirits being so integral to voodoo. And I would also like to acknowledge my positionality of talking about this question, as I'm not a practitioner of voodoo, but studied it in a academic setting. But with the spirits having almost duality, even female spirits, I think is very interesting. And I'm trying to figure out a way to work that in, because the spirit for water, for example, she is depicted, I think, as calm, but then there are other feminine spirits based in nature who are feisty. So you don't have just these nice, kind tropes or sweet, the sweet as water, or excuse me, sweet as sugar cane, sweet as flowers, I believe is Omasaka Natasha Tinsley quote. So there is a feminine presence there. And I do think that's very interesting that, it's again, not just this like sweet presence, it's that duality, and there's feisty, there's also, maternal spirits, I guess, as well. But with the presence of, like we could also get into that idea of potometan and voodoo ceremonies about, like being the center point. That would be also interesting to talk about, and that conception of how the environment, religion, all works together. Does that answer your question, or I can touch on more? Glynis,
I would love to hear more if you have more.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I would also, if you ever want to chat via email, I would be very interested to know about your research as well. But
Sure.
yeah, I was very much inspired by Colin Dans. I know they, I believe, recently changed their name, so I want to make sure I'm addressing them correctly. But there were God's, oh my gosh, I'm blanking, sorry, end of the semester fog. I don't know if you are all feeling this. Haiti, history, and gods.
Yeah.
Yes.
Diane.
Yes,
Yeah.
Miss Yumfuse. And that basically what I'm very interested in, that duality. I think it's very fascinating that also helps to disturb the myth of passivity.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you so much. I will definitely email. Yeah, I've just for time, I'll email you and we can absolutely continue that conversation. But I see David asked a question as well.
And also,
Sure,
if I may
absolutely.
just add some, I don't know if you remember, I know Rose, at some point, Rose is like this merchandise who's giving like her body. And at some point, there's this dédoublage that happened, like, and it's been a while since I've read the novel and taught it, so I don't have all the details in my head, but she's being raped, but it's almost like she leaves her body and she's imagining. So I think that's one of the ways, off the top of my head, I can think that that voodoo shows up. And even in thinking of the destruction of the land, the destruction of then you destroy the religion, you destroy the culture, because in order to have ceremony, you physically need land. So that's also this equal criticism. If you don't have the physical land, you're not able to maintain the culture. So
absolutely. And it was really fascinating. Last thought is Gina Ulysse, her article was actually talking about the movie Avatar and comparing it to what was happening, or what is happening in Haiti, and the deforestation, destruction of land, which I thought was very fascinating. I would have never thought to take that or make that comparison of Avatar and Haiti. It's a very beautifully and well-written article. Yes, Miss.
Yeah, I was like, let's drop citations in the chat so that people can find out about authors. Great. So our next question, I'll leave the English is there to be read. I'll try to give it a gloss. It's more complicated. Est-ce que vous avez un encadrement sur discussion pour peut-être, I guess what I am understanding is, est-ce qu'il est nécessaire pour félicitations ça? Like, do you need to make the citation? ou bien inclure dans l'évaluation qui est comparative avec l'autre terre coloniale. Yeah, okay, I'll take it away.
Merci, David. I think that's a great idea. And I was very much struggling with that because it's like, well, I have scientific data. And I think maybe to put it bluntly is my northern brain was like, well, I have to support it with this data. But the more and more I look at it and the different scientific, I was trying to, go deep into the science and scientific articles. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. And I think, and I'm going to use your words, that 1% of forest lie actually perpetuates this narrative of, oh, there's only 1% of forest left, like kind of creating this perpetuating this idea of just destruction and just, I don't want to put it simply put, but sadness of, the environmental damage happening when there's more than 1% of the forest left and more continuing to be grown. I mean, Soil is not the other organization, but it's the one that's in the top of my brain right now, just because I've been in contact with them. But there are other on the ground forces working against that. And then comparative evaluation with other colonized lands. Yes, I actually have thought, and I don't know if I can put this in my dissertation again. I have a huge problem. I don't know if any of the other students have this, of staying focused on just one particular thing. When I presented my proposal to Cecile a couple months ago, she's like, you have like 4 dissertations in here. But I think it'd be really fascinating to even take looking at the Dominican Republic. What is the makeup of their nature being equally colonized? So I think that would be a very fascinating avenue to take, actually. And the historical point, if I understand your question correctly, it's the American it's a tail end of the Duvalier dictatorship, as well as the invasion of the US. Hopefully that answered your question. David, hopefully. And I'm also seeing your second comment, David, that is interesting. Beyond voodoo and Dessalines' original constitution, there were strict codes on if and what one can cut a tree. I'm definitely writing that down to look deeper into that, because that's fascinating. I did not know that.
Yeah, and even today, again, this is why I tell students, you can't believe what CBS, NBC, and even NPR say. So you have to look at Haitian sources. I know I'm from the Central Plateau, and I know, and this was before COVID, last time I was in Haiti, with a couple of years, there were literally people, section communale, section régionale, however you call them, whose job was to keep people from cutting trees. So the idea that we all there in Haiti, the Haitians are there waiting for the white person to come and tell them to respect nature. Since we're being recorded, I won't say what it is, but it's such a bunch of crap. Because the person, and this is where I think the earlier question about voodoo comes in, the idea is for the vrai vaudouism, I'm not talking about doing things for tourists, they have to be close to nature, close to the land. Fundamentally, there's a respect for nature, there's a respect for the land. Even when an animal is being sacrificed to eat, you have to do it in a certain way. You have to acknowledge, I am taking this chicken or this cow, I am taking its life, it's giving me food. It has to be done properly. And voodoo is not the only religion that does that, but we don't hear about these things. Pour moun qui Samantha dit, c'est que toujours dit étudiant, faut yo faire attention pour yo pas tendre ça média Amérique du Nord bien européen répéter sous affaire manque de respect pour la nature, parce que, par exemple, pour retourner à une question qu'on t'a posée plus tôt, gen vrai vaudouisan, gon respect fondamental pour la nature. Li pa pral juste couper un pied bois, li besoin pied bois, li pa ouais que li en dehors de la nature, mais li ouais que li ensemble avec la nature. Et ces gens de bagay sa yo que nous pas tendé, les nap tendé missionnaire yo calé pour yo purifier Haïti, yo pral fait Tintin dans période bois caïman, yo pas vraiment yo pas comprendre qui ça culture vrai culture vaudois m'pa parler moun capti quelque pour faire cérémonie pour blanc yo pour blanc yo ouais m'a parle vrai moun qui vraiment en contact qui vrai vaudouisant.
Actually, an article that I'm working on right now is the presence of voodoo and the representation of voodoo in Princess and the Frog, Disney's Princess and the Frog, and other movies, but Princess and the Frog is my main focus, and just how the North represents voodoo. And exactly, I was talking about how oftentimes Hollywood movies will depict the senseless murder of a chicken, but it is way more than that, and that's such an oversimplification. It's it's for a purpose. It's in a ceremonial context. It's not just this. I don't want to say anymore because I'm still formulating that paper and thoughts, but yeah, it's I think that's a perfect example as well. Cecile.
I might please have any more questions coming in, but I was wondering if I could, I was thinking about this topic about the changes to environment, and like this semester I was teaching for the first time a course on Caribbean architectures, which involved a good deal of discussion of landscape and the transition or transformation of the landscape at the point of settler colonialism. And so I also wonder if there's, I mean, I think there's more literature in sort of indigenous studies on how an idea of an original forest is also just this very colonial way of approaching preservation, right? Because I think that part of the debate on this 1% hinges on semantics about original forest cover versus new growth forest cover, so that, but that this idea that landscapes were static prior to European settler arrival is also part of the problem, right? That forests and landscapes were being engaged with and manipulated continuously. So that's on my mind.
Yeah, I'm not confident on her last name, unfortunately, but a book that I've been working with a lot is Plants and Empire by Londa Schomburg, and they touch upon even names of native flora and fauna, and I'm going to use Gime for them because identification of these plants and this flora was already there, but the Europeans came and they were like, well, this doesn't fit our classification system. And that names were, original names were attempted to be destroyed. And uses, they were like, you can't, colonizing powers were like, well, no, that can't be used for this, or, it was that weird power dynamic of they relied on the knowledge of the people that were there. But they were attempting to also muddy that and change what the names of these objects were. So I think that is also fascinating. It's like the names were almost lost, or in some cases have been lost. So yeah, Plants and Empire by Londa Schomburg is has been a really integral text to me on that topic.
Yeah, I just put something on the chat. That's one of my favorite podcasts. Whenever I'm teaching about Haiti, I have students listen to, because it's with Patrick Bellegarde-Smith. I love a lot of his work, but it's a podcast so they can listen to it. And it's one of the most well thought out, clear explanation of voodoo. And he talks about how going to some Protestant churches in the US, you will think people are being slain in the spirit if you've ever been in the South, so again, who gets to decide which religion is superior? We cannot talk about religion without talking about power, without talking about colonialism. For me, we always have to go back to colonialism. So, ça m't'a dit, c'est juste que yon nan podcast moi aimé en pile de Patrick Bellegarde-Smith sous vaudou et que comment li contextualiser vaudou et puis m'apprécie en pile que li dit ou pas capable parler de vaudou sans pas parler de question pouvoir et puis sans nous pas parler de colonialisme. Qu'est-ce qui décide en religion pas bon ou non? Faut nous contextualiser et puis faut nous ouais ça fait pouvoir. Merci.
Oh, we have another, I'm sorry, losing track of the chat. So, a follow-up question from David about, from an eco-critical perspective of literature, is Vu Chauvet critiquing Mr. Long and the US's role in degrading Haitian land? Furthermore, how does it differ from her class exploits of the peasants and agricultural workers? It seems as coffee merchants that exploitation is there, whereas Mr. Long's exploitation attacks the source of the very agricultural base of the nation.
I'm actually screenshotting that question because that is an amazing question, and that's at the base of what I'm trying to figure out. Because I was a little stuck there for a while. Because I was like, when that was actually one of the moments where I realized, like, oh, Claire is not an ecofeminist because she's doing the same thing he is. Because I was just looking at what she was saying towards Mr. Long. I think my initial thoughts on that would be while she does, she does have privilege as an upper class bourgeois at the time. I wonder if her history as a that's a really good question, David. Because Monsieur Long, I was taking as what was I? Yeah, so Monsieur Long, I took him more as a larger scale. So not just like in her particular, or excuse me, in the particular village. I was taking Monsieur Long, and I believe I'm reading Vauchevet, taking Monsieur Long as just encompassing the entire island of Haiti, not just this particular village. Whereas perhaps Claire might have been more on a local, if that makes sense, a more local impact. But for your question of how does it differ from her class exploits, or excuse me, how her class exploits the, wait, scroll up. Okay, how her class exploits the peasants and agricultural workers. I think the instance of her selling the land at first to them as like, okay, I am helping my community, but then I was like, well, they're making more than her, they're producing more. So then she sells to the international seller, Monsieur Petrol, who is different from Monsieur Long, at a lower price point to price gouge. So sorry, David, I'm just like trying to see all of your lovely comments. But yeah, I was struggling, and I would love your input. I don't know if Claire could be one could say she is in alliance with the US, as part of the elite in Haiti. I'm not sure. I don't know if she would qualify as the elite. And that was something
she is definitely part of this elite, and there's a whole background story about Mary Chauvet herself, who's part of this elite, and those of us who are literary scholars for a while until there was this publication. We were working literally from 5 copies that you had in all of the US. All of us in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000 were working because the book could not be published. Essentially, because of her family. So she's definitely from the elite, and I don't mean to take over, but I am working with Sam. So
yes, please, because I was
this conversation. Part of it is that we can compare this to the same elite today who's working with the US government, who's destroying Haiti. So this is what's complex about colonization. It's the neocolonization, neocolonizers who are selling the country, because the US always, the US always allow them because it's their own benefit. We saw the same thing, whether it was the occupation of 1915, we saw the repeated occupation. So it is the elite colonizers and the elite themselves, they are part of that dédoublage that I mentioned, because they allow the US and others to take over. They're the one who the elite who's exploiting the little coffee merchant. And we see that with Claire. Claire is complex in that already. There's the color, we see colorism in the novel. We see the fact that she is not following order because she doesn't, the patriarchal order, that is because she doesn't have a male partner. We see all this happening, but we also see her using her power as somebody from the elite to further exploit the farmers, which is why she is part of that. She is one of the colonizers and part of the people exploiting the land, I will argue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for your comments, and thanks, David. I'm very much puzzled by that question still.
Yeah.
I think maybe we're coming to a close. Can I invite maybe Cecile and Sam to offer any closing thoughts you've got? Yeah. Or if there are any burning last questions, it's your last call.
I just would like to say thank you so much for this opportunity to share my chapter with you all. It is still very much a work in progress, and the due date is rapidly approaching. So I'm very thankful to work through some of these ideas and also move on to my next chapter. It's a very daunting task.
You can do it. Au café,
Merci, merci.
Merci Magali à Kiren qui fait tout travail, qui fait des scènes pour faire sa fête. Merci. Et merci tout le monde pour présence nous. Thank you everybody. Thank you Salvatore.
Merci Sal.
David.
My genuine pleasure.
Atali, Nancy, Walner, OJ, merci tout le monde. Glynis, Gideon, merci. Et pas oublier demain, gen rassemblement. Tomorrow is the town hall. Please come. We need you. HSA needs you so that you can share your ideas, how you see us moving forward. Alors, n'attend tout le monde demain si Dieu veut, de 2h à 4h, les New York. Merci en pile. Merci Irène.
Merci.
Merci, merci.
Merci Magali. Merci Sam.
Merci.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Bonne chance tout le monde avec ce semestre.
Oui, merci. Bon courage tout le monde. Bye bye.